So let's take that rule and let's practice, okay? We did talk about how you can either separate numbers into their factor pairs, into products, or you can put them together. So in this case, since 5 and 10, since neither one square root, then we want to put them together and try a different factor pair. So let's multiply them together, and we get the square root of 50. And then off to the side, think of your factor pairs. 1 and 50, neither one of those has a perfect square, or will square root. 2 and 25. Well, that is exactly what we want, because 25 square roots. Okay, you could have gone back to 5 and 10, but that doesn't do anything, because we just put them together because they didn't square root themselves. So instead of 5 and 10, let's look at them as 25 and 2, and I wrote the 25 first on purpose because that square roots to the number 5, root 2. Okay, so the root 2 has to stay, but that square root of 25 will actually square root. So that is as simple as it will go. Okay, this is a practice of rationalizing the denominator. So we go through and we say, okay, let me square root each of them separately. So the square root of 9 and the square root of 11. Since these don't reduce themselves, let's break them up and see what we can work with. Well, we do know that the square root of 9 is actually a 3, and then square root of 11 doesn't do anything, okay? But we have that rule about not having a root or a radical in the denominator, so now we have to get rid of it. So if I have the square root of 3 over the square root of 11, okay, remember the opposite of square rooting is squaring. So if we multiply it by itself, okay, that's like squaring it. So that 11 will come out, or we'll be square rooting its product. So whatever I do on bottom, I have to do on top. Okay, be careful. You actually don't multiply those together. This is a constant. It's a number up front. That's a radical, so you treat them separately. You just say 3 root 11. You can only multiply them if they're both roots. So here we can multiply them because it was square root and square root. But here, one's a number, one's a root. So we keep them separated. This is 11 times 11, because they're both roots, is 121. But the square root of 121 is just that number 11. So you get 3 root 11 over 11. Okay, so whenever you multiply the same thing, it brings that number out of the root, okay? And it actually brings the root up top, which some people start seeing kind of that pattern. So that's just what you do, is you take the number out and you put the root up top instead, okay? So that's practicing simplifying just a little bit more, and we're going to practice in class because I know it takes some time to kind of get used to the system. But there is another rule down here that I want to talk about. Okay, and this rule, we use it a ton in Algebra 2. And this rule is that square rooting a negative, okay? Because sometimes as you do your problems, especially in Algebra 2, you'll get a negative number, and when you try to square root it, your calculator actually has an error on it. It actually doesn't work. So somebody somewhere decided that if we're going to square root a negative, right here, we are going to call that imaginary. Okay? And imaginary means we're going to pull that negative out, and we're going to put an I in its place. Okay? So imaginary numbers. Okay? And we do talk about it a ton in Algebra 2. If you talk to other students who've taken Algebra 2, and you talk about I, they'll know what you're talking about. They're talking about negative inside the root, okay? So all that means, okay, if you were to put that into your calculator, it would say non-real. Well, non-real means fake, or it means imaginary. So that means that this negative inside the root, it's actually impossible, because you can't square anything and get a negative. So what we do is we pull it outside of the root, as an I. We take that negative inside and we pull it out and we write I so that whoever looks at it knows that's an imaginary answer. And you'll see what imaginary means when we get back into solving and back into graphing and that kinds of stuff, okay? So a negative in the root really just means I. And I had a teacher say, pull your eyes out. Okay, pull your eyes out. So if you see that negative, pull that out as an I, okay? So then the property of 1 means that if you square negatives or you square i's, there's a pattern to it, okay? And we could do it in our calculator, but there is just kind of a pattern that we want to keep in mind, okay? And what that means is since I is a negative, that means there's a negative in here. Well, since you need something to hold that place value, think of it as a -1. That means that when you square it, okay, when you square this -1, the square and the square root cancel. So that means that I squared is just the number -1. It actually cancels, this square cancels out the square root and it brings the -1 out. I to the third has its own path. Now you've got 2 of these and 1 of those, so it's -1 times negative square root of 1, because there's 3 of them, so it's this times this. And then I to the fourth just means you're saying you're multiplying 2 of these, so that's the number +1. And we're going to practice that later. We are going to practice it later, but that's what this is talking about. So if I'm squaring an I right there, if this is something squared, I'm squaring each of those, okay? And when I'm squaring I, well, I squared is just the number -1. So it's -1 times 3, which is a -3. And we're not going to practice that a ton right now. We'll practice it later, but not quite yet. But this just means that I'm squaring each of those. Square and square root cancel. That's why the 3 is there. And then I squared is just that square and square root cancel. And that's why we get a -1, okay? But really what I care about practicing is seeing the I inside here and actually remembering, pull your eyes out. Pull your eyes out. And then there's things that you can do with I, just like there were things that we did with those roots, okay? So that's what we're going to practice next.